Floor 38. 1 in the morning. The kind of silence that hums. Daniel Pruitt pushes a mop cart through a corridor that wasn't built for people like him. Marble floors, glass walls, the faint smell of recycled air, and expensive ambition. His gray uniform catches none of the light. That's the point. Janitors aren't supposed to be seen. But then he stops. Through the soundproof glass of the auxiliary server room, a monitor pulses blue in the dark. On its screen, one line, one sequence, armed and scheduled for 6 a.m. He knows that code. He wrote it 4 years ago with 3 safety layers built in to keep exactly this from happening. Every single one of them is gone. His mop handle creaks under his grip. Somewhere across Chicago, tens of thousands of people are asleep, trusting that the lights will still be on by morning. They won't be. The notebook was the only thing on the cart that didn't belong there. It was wedged between 2 rolls of paper towels, small, spiral-bound, its cover warped from months of being carried in and out of cold corridors. Anyone who noticed it would have assumed it was a personal journal, maybe a grocery list. Nobody ever looked closely enough to see that every page was covered in circuit diagrams, voltage load curves, tolerance margins written in a hand, so practiced the numbers barely needed space to breathe. Daniel Pruitt had not worked as an engineer in 4 years. He still could not stop thinking like one. He was 34, though most nights he felt older. The job at Crestline Power Solutions was a night shift, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. 5 days a week, and he had taken it not because he wanted it, but because it was the only arrangement that worked. Daytime. He dropped Nora at school, picked her up in the afternoon, made dinner, helped with homework. He was home when she needed him to be home. Then, after she fell asleep, he drove to the building and became invisible for the next 8 hours. Gray uniform, laminate badge, a cart with squeaky wheels that announced him before he rounded any corner. That was the point of the squeaky wheels, actually. He had never gotten around to fixing them. Better that people heard him coming and looked away before he arrived. Floor 38 was supposed to be the easiest part of his route. The executive suites were dark by 10. The glass-walled conference room sat empty chairs, still angled from whatever meeting had run long that afternoon. He moved through them methodically, the way he moved through everything now focused on what was directly in front of him, not on the periphery, not on the things behind glass walls he was not supposed to understand. But his ears had never learned to stop working. The sound came first. Not an alarm, not anything dramatic, just a shift in the rhythm of the cooling fans inside the auxiliary server room at the far end of the corridor. A half-step change in frequency, the kind of thing you felt in your back teeth before you registered it consciously. Daniel had spent 6 years listening to power systems the way musicians listen to orchestras. He heard the wrong note before he understood why it was wrong. He kept walking. He did not look at the server room. He made it 14 steps past the door before he stopped. Through the soundproof glass, the auxiliary monitor pulsed blue in the darkness. One line of text. He read it from across the room, without meaning, to the way you read a road sign you already know by heart. Automation sequence, DX09 armed. Deploy 0600. The mop handle creaked. DX09. He knew that name the way he knew his own signature. The load distribution module designed to balance power, draw across 3 districts simultaneously during high-demand events. He had spent 11 months building it from the ground up at a subsidiary firm that Crestline had since absorbed. He had found the synchronization fault buried in the original architecture, a flaw that would have gone undetected until exactly the wrong moment. He had redesigned the entire sequence with 3 independent safety checks, each one a separate gate the system had to pass before it was authorized to touch a live grid. The screen showed none of those gates. The sequence was stripped down to its skeleton armed and scheduled to run in less than 5 hours during what would be Crestline's largest live demonstration in company history. a smart grid contract worth $80 million presented before the Chicago City Council and a room full of investors. The kind of morning that the company had been building toward for 2 years. The kind of morning that would end before it began, if that sequence ran the way it was currently written. Daniel stood in the corridor for a long moment, eyes on the glass. He thought about Nora. She was 7. She still slept with the hall light on. She had her mother's way of tilting her head when she was thinking about something important. And Grace had been gone for 2 years, and sometimes the resemblance was enough to stop Daniel mid-sentence at the dinner table. He had learned to breathe through those moments. He had learned to keep moving. This was supposed to be a stable job, 7 months without incident, the kind of work that didn't follow him home. He looked down at the card clipped to his belt. Standard issue. Every janitorial staff member carried one for emergency access to mechanical and buffer rooms, fire risk, flooding, temperature spikes. The card existed for exactly these situations technically. A maintenance override for thermal anomalies was within the scope of his clearance. If he used it, there would be a log entry with his name attached to it. If he didn't use it, there would be no log entry. There would also be a grid failure affecting 3 Chicago districts at 6 in the morning in the middle of January. He reached for the card reader and stopped with his hand, an inch from the surface. Stood there. Then he stepped back and looked at the monitor again, as if a second reading might change what the screen said. It didn't. The memory came back the way it always did. Not gradually, but all at once. 4 years ago, he had walked into a board presentation with a 40-page safety report under his arm, and the kind of confidence that only exists before it gets used against you. His firm's director, Russell Tate, had already submitted the module for approval. What Daniel didn't know, what he had no reason to suspect, was that Tate had stripped 2 of the 3 safety layers from the final build. Faster deployment, cleaner numbers on the timeline, the kind of shortcut that works perfectly until it doesn't. The system failed during the live test. It failed in front of every senior executive in the room. And at the bottom of the incident report, in the section titled Responsible Party, was one name. Not Tate's. Unauthorized system modification. Daniel Pruitt, lead engineer. He lost the job within the week. The consulting contracts followed. The research fellowship he had been 3 months from securing sent a polite email that said nothing directly and meant everything clearly. He had spent the next year trying to correct the record through the right channels, formal appeals, archived version comparisons, documented correspondence. None of it moved fast enough to matter. The industry had already heard the short version. 6 months after the incident, Grace died in a car accident on a Tuesday morning in February. He had been at home filing another appeal. After the funeral, he stopped filing. He had Nora to raise, and the appeals were taking time he no longer had. Now he stood in front of the server room door on floor 38 with a janitorial access card and 7 months of clean record and a daughter asleep at a neighbor's house 2 miles away. He pressed the card against the reader. He pulled it back. He looked at the monitor one more time. The timestamp in the corner read 1:09 a.m. The deploy counter had not changed. The sequence was still armed. He thought about the 3 districts. He thought about January. He thought about the notebook tucked between the paper towel rolls on his cart. All those circuit diagrams that had nowhere to go, all that knowledge that had cost him everything and still refused to leave. Then he pressed the card against the reader and held it there. The door clicked open. The inside of the auxiliary buffer room smelled like warm metal and recycled cold air. Daniel had 6 minutes and 47 seconds, he knew this only afterward from the logs, to understand what he was looking at. What he found was worse than what he had seen through the glass. DX09 hadn't simply been scheduled to run. It had been embedded directly into the live automation chain, the same chain that would be running in real time during the morning demonstration, feeding actual load data from actual substations across 3 Chicago districts. The safety layers weren't reduced. They weren't simplified. They were gone entirely in the same way they had been gone 4 years ago, as if someone had taken his original work and deliberately returned it to the version that had failed. The sequence was set to fire at 6 a.m. The demonstration started at 8. If the grid destabilized during the 2-hour window, before anyone was even in the room to watch, the failure would already be done by the time the city council representatives finished their coffee. Daniel did not have system access. He could not rewrite the sequence. He could not delete the schedule entry or flag it through any internal channel without a login that would require credentials he hadn't held in 4 years and a clearance level that his gray uniform had never come close to. What he had was a thermal maintenance override, a legitimate safety feature built into janitorial access cards for exactly the situations that required slowing a system down without shutting it off entirely. If he logged a temperature anomaly in the buffer room, the automation chain would enter a precautionary hold, delaying execution by several hours, while the system waited for human confirmation to proceed. It was not a fix, it was time. Maybe enough time for someone with actual access to find the problem before 6 a.m. became a crisis. He activated the override. The screen shifted from blue to amber. The deploy counter froze. He collected his cart, walked back to the elevator, and did not look at the server room glass again as he passed it. Sloan Merritt had been CEO of Crestline Power Solutions for 11 months, and she had learned in the first 2 of them that the most important information in any building rarely came from the people who were supposed to deliver it. She was 36. She had taken over after the previous generation of leadership retired in the same quarter, a transition that the board had called smooth, and that she privately understood to mean she had inherited every problem they had chosen not to solve. The smart grid contract with Chicago was the largest deal in the company's history. She had personally restructured 2 departments and cut 1 product line to make this morning's demonstration possible. At 6 a.m., sitting at her desk with the overnight security log open on her left monitor and the demonstration run sheet on her right, she received an automated alert thermal anomaly, flagged in auxiliary buffer room floor 38. Override initiated by maintenance staff at 1:09 a.m. Temperature readings normalized by 1:17. She pulled up the camera footage. She watched the man in the gray uniform push his cart down the corridor. She watched him stop. She watched him reach for the card reader, pull his hand back, stand motionless for several seconds, long enough that anyone observing casually would have assumed he was reading something on his phone. Then she watched him press the card through and go inside. She played it back twice, then a 3rd time slower, watching the moment his hand stopped an inch from the reader. He had understood the risk before he went in. That was not the behavior of someone acting carelessly or opportunistically. That was the behavior of someone making a decision they knew they couldn't undo. Her assistant Brett pulled the employee file in 4 minutes. Daniel Pruitt. Janitorial staff night shift 7 months with the company. 1 incident on record 4 years old from a subsidiary firm, Crestline, had absorbed in the merger. The incident report listed module DX09 and the words unauthorized system modification beside his name. Sloan looked at the module name in the incident report. She looked at the thermal alert on her other screen, which also referenced DX09 in the system log. She opened the archived build history from the subsidiary's servers, a database she had specifically requested be preserved during the merger over the objections of 2 people who had said it wasn't necessary. She found 2 versions of the DX09 module. The dates told the rest of the story without requiring any further explanation. She told Brett to locate Daniel Pruitt and ask him to come to floor 38. Not to security, not to HR. To her. Daniel had been sitting in the break room on the 2nd floor, still in his uniform, waiting for the end of his shift, when Brett found him. He rode the elevator to the 38th floor, expecting to be handed a termination form. Instead, he was shown into a glass-walled strategy room he had cleaned dozens of times without ever sitting in. Sloan Merritt was already there. She was standing at the whiteboard, with a marker in her hand, and the monitor on the conference table showed two side-by-side build histories, DX09 version 1 and version 2. She set the marker down on the table in front of an empty chair across from her. She looked at him, the way someone looks at a document they are still deciding how to read. "I pulled both versions from the archive," she said. "The one with your name on the incident report, and the one that was actually submitted for deployment 4 years ago." Daniel looked at the screen. He had spent a long time trying not to look at those files. "They're not the same build," Sloan said. "No," Daniel said. "They're not." She gestured at the whiteboard at the marker on the table. "Walk me through the fault." He picked up the marker. He stood at the board for a moment, not performing hesitation, simply recalibrating the way you do when something you had filed away as permanently inaccessible suddenly has a door open in front of it. Then he started drawing. Load distribution nodes, synchronization triggers, the point in the sequence where without the first safety gate, a simultaneous demand spike across 2 districts would create a feedback loop that the system had no mechanism to interrupt. He drew for 6 minutes. He explained as he drew concisely without editorializing. When he finished, the diagram on the board looked exactly like the one in the warped notebook, still sitting on his cart downstairs. Sloan studied it. If the sequence runs as currently armed, the load spike happens within 90 seconds of activation, Daniel said. The grid won't fail immediately. It'll oscillate. That's actually worse because the system will keep trying to self-correct until the substations trip. By the time anyone sees the failure mode, it's already cascading. How long to fix it properly? With access to the core architecture, 2 hours. Maybe less. She was already reaching for her phone when the door opened. Brett stepped into the room with the look of someone who had been asked to interrupt a surgery. "I'm sorry," Brett said. The senior leadership thread someone just posted the incident report. Sloan's expression didn't shift. "Which one?" "The 4-year-old one. Just the header page. No context, no archive comparison." Brett kept his eyes on Sloan professionally, avoiding looking at Daniel. "Director Sutter is asking for the temporary access to be revoked pending review. He says it's a liability issue before the presentation." The room held a specific kind of silence, not the absence of sound, but the presence of something no one wanted to be the first to name. Daniel set the marker down on the whiteboard tray. He did not rush the movement. He picked up his notebook from the table where he had set it when he sat down. He picked up the guest laptop Sloan had given him temporary credentials for. Then he picked up the cup of coffee that Brett had placed in front of him 20 minutes ago when the conversation was still going well, and which he had not yet taken a single sip of. He set the coffee back down. Sloan looked at him. There was something behind her expression that was not quite an apology, and not quite a promise. Something more precise than either the look of someone who is still calculating and does not want to pretend otherwise. "I'll look into it," she said. "I know," Daniel said. He meant it. He left the room and took the elevator to the lobby and sat down in a chair near the front entrance, facing the glass doors and the gray Chicago morning beyond them. The street outside was already moving early commuters, a delivery truck idling at the corner pigeons on the concrete ledge across the way. The city operating exactly as expected, entirely unaware that 8 hours from now it was either going to be fine or it wasn't. He thought about Nora at the neighbor's house, still asleep, probably her shoes lined up at the door, the way he had taught her. Her backpack ready for a school day he was supposed to be home for in 2 hours. He thought about the diagram still on the whiteboard upstairs. He thought about the marker he had set down in the tray instead of the table, and how that was the kind of thing you did when you wanted to leave something easy to pick up again. 13 minutes passed. Daniel stood up. Not because the fear had gone anywhere, it hadn't. It was still present, the specific weight of it, the knowledge of everything he could still lose. But the fear had been there last night too, in the corridor on floor 38, and he had pressed the card to the reader anyway. Not because the situation was safe, because he was the only person in the building who understood why it wasn't. That had not changed. He took out his phone and typed one message to the number Brett had added to his contacts that morning. "Give me 8 minutes with the rollback history. If I'm wrong, I'll walk out and not come back." He watched the screen. 30 seconds. Then floor 38. Left elevator. He picked up his notebook and walked across the lobby. The left elevator opened onto floor 38 at 7:41 a.m. Sloan was waiting in the strategy room with 2 things on the conference table: the guest laptop already logged in, and a fresh cup of coffee placed where the previous one had gone cold. She didn't comment on the 13 minutes he had spent in the lobby. She pointed at the chair and slid the laptop toward him. "Rollback history," she said. 8 minutes. Daniel sat down and opened the system log. He didn't need 8 minutes. He needed 5. The rollback entry sat in the overnight maintenance log with a timestamp of 11:43 p.m., nearly 90 minutes before Daniel had even arrived at floor 38. It was written cleanly structured, the way automated entries look, the kind of log line that was designed to be skimmed past during a routine morning review. But it wasn't automated. The syntax was slightly off from the system standard, formatting the kind of variance that only appeared when a command was entered manually and formatted to look like it hadn't been. The credentials attached to the entry belonged to a junior engineer named Marcus Webb, who, according to the scheduling system open in the adjacent window, had been in a client call from 11 p.m. to 1:15 a.m. His access card had not been used to enter the building at any point during that window. Someone had used Marcus Webb's login remotely, someone who knew which credentials to borrow and how long the alibi would hold. Someone who had done something like this before. Daniel opened the archived personnel directory from the subsidiary merger. He found the access authorization list from 4 years ago. He placed it beside the current senior staff directory and looked at the name that appeared in both. Russell Tate, Senior Director of Engineering, Crestline Power Solutions, previously Director of Operations at the subsidiary firm, where DX09 was originally built, originally stripped, and originally blamed on a lead engineer who had since spent 4 years driving a used sedan and pushing a mop cart through corridors that weren't built for him. Daniel turned the laptop to face Sloan without saying anything. She read both screens. She read them again. Then she asked Brett, who was standing by the door, to contact the head of security and the building's IT infrastructure lead directly. The door opened. Russell Tate walked in the way powerful people enter rooms they believe belong to them, not aggressively, but with the specific ease of someone who has never had to wait to be invited. He was in his early 50s, silver at the temples, wearing the kind of suit that communicated its price through restraint rather than display. He took in Daniel first. His expression registered something, processed it, and filed it away in under 2 seconds. "Sloan." Tate's voice was measured. "I wasn't aware we were running additional technical reviews this morning, given the timeline." "Sit down, Russell," Sloan said. It was not a request. The flatness in her voice was the kind that came from having already finished an argument in her head. Tate sat. He looked at the laptop screen. Both columns, both directories, and the ease in his posture shifted by a fraction. Not enough to be called alarm. Enough to be called recognition. "The rollback entry in last night's maintenance log," Sloan said. "Marcus Webb's credentials. Walk me through how that happened." "I'd need to look at the specific log before I could." "It's on the screen." Tate looked at it for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had reorganized itself into something more careful. "System access at that level can be delegated. Marcus may have authorized remote use of his login for an overnight task. It's not standard procedure, but it's not unheard of." "Marcus was on a client call from 11 p.m. until after 1 a.m., Sloan said. "Verified by the client's own conferencing log, which IT pulled 12 minutes ago. He wasn't in the building. He didn't delegate anything. His credentials were used without his knowledge." The room did not fill with dramatic sound. Nobody raised their voice. Tate looked at the screen, the way a person looks at something they had calculated would not be found in time, and the calculation had been wrong. What was deployed in DX09 last night? Daniel said, not to Tate, to the table, to the specific data on the screen, is identical to the version that failed 4 years ago. Not similar, identical. Same stripped architecture, same missing gates, same failure point in the synchronization trigger. He kept his eyes on the laptop. I built the version with the safety layers. I have the original build file with timestamps that predate the incident report by 6 weeks. I filed for version comparison through formal appeal channels 4 years ago. Nobody ran the comparison. I ran it this morning, Sloan said. The archive was preserved in the merger database. Tate said nothing. Across the room, a junior engineer named Holt, one of the infrastructure team members Sloan had pulled in earlier that morning to monitor the live grid feed, looked up from his workstation. Load variance is climbing on the northwest substation feed. The room shifted. The override hold is degrading, Daniel said, already moving to the secondary monitor. The thermal maintenance flag has a 6-hour ceiling. It's been almost 6 hours. Holt pulled up the live grid data. The numbers were moving, not catastrophically, not yet, but the pattern was the same pattern Daniel had diagrammed on the whiteboard 2 hours ago. The oscillation was beginning. The system was searching for balance. It wasn't architected to find. We need to push the patched build, Daniel said. He turned to Sloan. I wrote the restore sequence from memory in the notebook. I can walk Holt through implementing it, but we need core access, and we need it now. You have it, Sloan said. She was looking at him with an expression he hadn't seen directed at him in a long time. Not sympathy, something more structural than that. Trust that had been tested and had held. If I authorize the patch and you're wrong. I'm not wrong, Daniel said. I've been not wrong about this for 4 years. The room held that statement for exactly as long as it needed to. Sloan looked at Holt. Give him core access. Log it under my authorization. Holt nodded and started typing. Tate stood up. Sloan, I have to advise you strongly against deploying an unverified patch written from memory by a maintenance worker 40 minutes before the biggest presentation in Roy. Russell. Sloan did not look at him. She was watching the grid data on Holt's monitor. I'm going to ask you to wait in the conference room down the hall. Security will be there shortly. The ease was entirely gone from Tate's posture now. What replaced it was not panic. He was too controlled for panic, but something adjacent to it. The recognition that the room had shifted its weight, and he was no longer at the center of it. He left without another word, which was, Daniel thought, probably the smartest decision Tate had made all morning. Holt implemented the patch at 8:22 a.m. The smart grid demonstration ran cleanly. The restored safety architecture held exactly as designed, and the city council representatives shook hands in a conference room 2 floors down, without any knowledge of what had been running beneath them all morning. The $80 million contract was signed before noon. Daniel had called the neighbor at 9 a.m., the first moment he had stepped away from Holt's workstation, long enough to think about anything other than load variance, to say he wouldn't be home until evening. The neighbor said Nora was fine. She had eaten breakfast. She was doing a puzzle on the living room floor and asking questions about how electricity worked. Daniel laughed for the first time in what felt like a long time. The grid's northwest substation continued showing elevated variance throughout the day, a residual effect of the overnight deployment that the patched module was now managing correctly, gate by gate, exactly as designed. At 5:47 p.m., Holt called out a spike, and the room went quiet, and everyone looked at the secondary screen, where Daniel's restored synchronization sequence was already doing what it was built to do. The system stabilized at 5:52 p.m., nearly 10 hours after the patch had gone in, and not a moment the city ever noticed. Daniel was still in the building. He hadn't been asked to leave, and he hadn't left. He sat in the strategy room on floor 38 for most of the day, working through the full diagnostic, with Holt documenting every deviation between the stripped build and the original building, the paper record, that Sloane's legal team had already said they would need for what came next. Russell Tate was suspended the same afternoon and terminated the following week. The formal investigation took 3 months, but the evidence was dense and well documented. The unauthorized credential used the version manipulation and a pattern of similar interventions stretching back further than DX09 cases, where Tate had restructured attribution after the fact, redirecting failures toward engineers who had less standing to dispute him. Craig Sutter, who had posted the 4-year-old incident report into the senior leadership thread that morning, was placed under internal review for conduct unbecoming of his role. He resigned before the review concluded. Daniel's personnel record was corrected. The incident notation was removed. The original DX09 build, time-stamped version controlled bearing his full architecture with all 3 safety layers intact, was entered into Crestline's formal technical archive as the authorized and originating design. 3 weeks after the night on floor 38, a nameplate appeared outside an office on the 22nd floor. Daniel Pruitt, Lead Systems. Integrity Engineer. He brought Nora to the building on a Saturday afternoon. She was wearing her red coat and the sneakers with the Velcro straps she still preferred over laces, and she ran her finger along the nameplate with the focused attention she gave to things she wanted to remember. The hallway was quiet. The building was nearly empty on weekends. "Is that your name?" she asked. "That's my name," Daniel said. She tilted her head, Grace's gesture exact and undiminished. "How long has your name been here?" He crouched down to her level, the way he did when the answer was going to take more than a moment to land. "It's been here longer than I have," he said. "I just had to find my way back to it." Nora looked at the nameplate for another few seconds. Then she took his hand, and they walked back to the elevator. The rooftop of the Crestline building was not a public space. Sloane had the access code, and she had offered it to Daniel on a Thursday evening in February, 3 weeks into his new role on a night when the rain had just stopped, and the city below was doing what Chicago does after rain, glittering without trying to. She brought the whiteboard marker, the same one from the morning of the demonstration which she had apparently kept in her desk drawer, which Daniel chose not to ask about. "First time I handed you that," Sloane said, "I needed to know who you were." Daniel looked at it in her hand. "And now I know." She held it out. "That's a different reason to give it to someone." He took it. He turned it over once in his hand, the way he had turned it over that morning on floor 38, when he was still a man in a gray uniform who had not yet decided whether the room he was standing in deserved what he was about to offer it. He looked out over the city. The lights of Chicago spread in every direction, uninterrupted, steady across all 3 districts, every substation running on the architecture he had built and rebuilt and refused to let go of. "I spent a lot of years making myself smaller," he said, "trying to fit into spaces that weren't worth the effort." Sloane stood beside him. Not close, not yet, but the distance between them was no longer the distance of 2 people guarding themselves. It was something quieter than that, something that hadn't been named yet and didn't need to be. "I think I'm done with that," Daniel said. The city held its lights. The wind moved through the rooftop in one long, unhurried pass. Neither of them spoke for a while after that. They didn't need to. Some things begin not with a word, but with the simple fact of 2 people standing in the same place, looking at the same lights, and neither one of them turning to leave.